Hi.
This is 911. What's your emergency?
Yes, okay. I have a client that came in. It's a client of mine. He hired me yesterday. I'm a family attorney. He just came in, and then right now he's going to St. Paul Catholic Church on Del Mabry. He has a child with him, his daughter. He left my office. He came out there with a Bible and started talking to me and saying that I was the creator, I was God, and then he wanted me to read the Bible to him. I said, I can't, it's in Swedish, and he started being really, he's nuts.
What, okay.
And he's just going out with a child. Huh?
Did you say he assaulted you?
No, he didn't. But what I'm saying is he's out of his mind, and he has a minor child with him driving to a church now, and I should have kept the child, and he was saying things like, I was supposed to file his paperwork today for a case. He's like, well, don't file the paperwork, it's not going to matter anymore. And then he wanted me to take him to the church, and then he wanted to leave the child here, and I should have kept the child, but now he's left with the child.
This is the call from the lawyer. Frantic, desperate, and full of fear. You need to send someone now, she urges, her voice shaking with the weight of a warning too dire to ignore. I'm telling you, something's wrong. Phoebe's in danger. But no one could have known just how close they were to the edge of a nightmare that no one could prevent. Hours later, Phoebe would be gone. Her life ripped away in the blink of an eye. What went wrong? Could this call have changed everything? On the night of January 8, 2015, Phoebe's dad lifted her from her bed. The moon shone brightly outside her window. The house was eerily quiet. He carried her out the door and into the darkness. It was a chilly night, especially for Florida. He didn't bother to zip her into a jacket or wrap her in a blanket. The 5-year-old wore only shorts and her green cat t-shirt, shivering in the cold air. Her dad was a tall man with a sturdy build, wild hair sticking out from under his hoodie. He wore plaid pajama bottoms as he gently placed Phoebe into the back of his PT Cruiser, fastening her into her pink booster seat. They sped down the highway, racing across Tampa Bay, reaching speeds of 80, 90, even 100 miles per hour. In St. Petersburg, a police car crept up behind them, its lights off but watching closely. As they approached the Sunshine Skyway Bridge, the PT Cruiser suddenly came to a stop, and Phoebe's dad climbed out. "Get back in the car," the officer shouted. "Let me see your hands." But instead of complying, Phoebe's dad walked between the cars and yelled back at the officer, "You have no free will." Then he moved to Phoebe's door, opened it, and pulled her out. He carried her toward the edge of the bridge. The salty breeze bit at her skin as the wind howled around them. Her small cheek pressed against his sweatshirt while he clutched her tightly to his chest. Suddenly, with a chilling grip, Phoebe's father held her over the guardrail, 6 stories above the shadowy, crashing waves below. John Nicholas Johnchuk Jr., 26, now resides in a state mental institution. Psychiatrists have deemed him unfit to stand trial. John Johnchuk Jr. was Phoebe's father, a sporadically employed telemarketer with a troubling past. He had a history of arrests for DUI and domestic violence. Friends claimed he was a heavy drug user, and his family reported he had been committed 27 times. It's hard to believe he could kill his own child. It's the only explanation that seems to fit, but few who knew him accept this notion. Family and friends describe him as a con artist, a manipulative, vindictive man who pushed away those who cared for him. He forged checks, faked injuries, and believed in demons but not in God. He was a schemer who exploited the courts for personal gain and revenge. A paranoid, angry meth addict, he had been arrested for battery and domestic violence 7 times, with his family counting 27 involuntary commitments. Yet, in its report on Phoebe's death, the Florida Department of Children and Families concluded, there was nothing in the preceding several years that could have reasonably been interpreted as predictive of such an event. Phoebe J. Johnchuk, just 5 years old, adored her father, who ultimately took her life. No one imagined John Johnchuk Jr. would murder his daughter. Friends insisted he was a good father who taught Phoebe to count trees, painted her tiny toenails pink, and loved sharing Slurpees that stained their lips blue. She was the light in his dark, troubled eyes. Whether he was truly crazy or just cunning, many believe John would harm someone. most likely his mother, whom he despised, or Phoebe's mother, whom he still loved. Phoebe clung to her dad as they moved from place to place. She slipped through one safety net after another. Her family knew how violent John could be. The state had been aware of him since he was 5. A dozen people witnessed him that last day, holding her hand while ranting about exorcisms and ominous biblical plans. So many people could have stopped him. No one did. It all started with signs that no one could ignore. Brian Morris had known John from the very beginning. Brian, the family's backbone, had raised John when no one else could or would. But even he couldn't deny the truth. He was born evil, Brian often said. John was no ordinary child. He was the one who kicked dogs, stuck screwdrivers into electrical sockets, and got expelled from preschools. John's early life was chaos. His father, a hard-drinking man with a violent streak, disappeared when John was only 3. His mother, battling her own demons with drugs, left when he was 5. With no one else, Brian and his partner Tim Maynard took John in. They gave him love and even a gold necklace with a tiny cross, hoping it would bring him peace. But peace never came. Tantrums turned into full-blown rages. Therapists suggested wrapping him in a sheet to calm him down, but that only led to broken shoes and bruised hearts. Medication did little to help. And then one day, John's father returned, not to mend fences, but to rip them apart. "I'm not going to let 2 fags raise my son," he shouted, taking John back. Living with his father only made things worse. John's friends saw the bruises he tried to hide, and the house often echoed with screams. Once, after an argument about cleaning his room, John grabbed a butcher knife and stormed out. Police reports described a boy full of anger, a boy who hoped his father would go to hell. In school, John stood out, not just for his humor or his knack for puppetry, but for his wild, unpredictable behavior. By 8th grade, he had come out as gay, shrugging off the taunts. But inside, his pain grew. At 15, he climbed onto a roof and slit his wrists. His family committed him to a hospital for the first time. Over the years, John's life spiraled further. He broke ribs, smashed laptops, and burned bridges with everyone who cared about him. Drugs became his escape, first spice and then crystal meth. The highs brought out the worst in him: rage, violence, and laughter at others' pain. When John met Michelle Kerr, it seemed like things might change. She was beautiful, with wide blue eyes and a kind smile. He told her she was the most beautiful woman he'd ever seen. They sang songs together, danced at clubs, and shared their broken pasts. But the darkness never left John. On Valentine's Day, jealousy drove him to slash Michelle's tires. Another time, he held up her mother's wedding ring, her most cherished memory, and hurled it into the yard. He could be sweet, Michelle said, but then the devil came out. No one saw what was coming next. Michelle stayed with John despite the chaos in their lives because she was pregnant. In August 2009, on a sunny morning, their daughter, Phoebe, was born. John chose the name inspired by his chihuahua. Phoebe was beautiful. A little girl with green eyes, honey-colored curls, and her father's round face. She was rarely fussy, easily comforted by soft songs or a gentle arm rub. John surprised everyone with his tenderness, changing diapers and warming bottles without hesitation. When Phoebe was born, it changed him, said his Uncle Brian. He stepped up more than we'd ever seen. Even John's estranged mother reappeared to see her granddaughter, proud of the devoted father her son had become. After maternity leave, Michelle planned to return to work, but her body betrayed her. Her left leg began to seize, making walking impossible. Doctors diagnosed her with multiple sclerosis, and she went on disability. John wanted to stay home with Phoebes, but financial struggles loomed. He tried telemarketing and dabbled in insurance, yet he mostly depended on Michelle's disability income while hatching dubious money-making schemes. He'd take people's social security numbers and credit cards, Michelle later said. John even bought a machine to print fake checks and once faked a fall at the Cheesecake Factory, suing the chain for $250,000. He bragged he'd never have to work again, she added. Phoebe was just 10 months old when deputies were first called to their home. John had thrown Michelle to the floor and punched her legs. After completing a court-ordered domestic violence program, the charges were dropped. 2 years later, neighbors called the police again. This time, John was choking Michelle. Phoebe, then too, locked herself in her parents' bedroom, only for John to kick the door down to get her out. Despite repeated interventions from child services, reports of family violence threatening the child were dismissed. Counseling was recommended, but the couple often skipped appointments. Phoebe was born into a family where the cycle of abandonment was all too familiar. Her great-grandmother had left her grandmother, and her grandmother had done the same to her father. None of them knew what it meant to be a good parent, and Phoebe was destined to repeat the pattern. Mama, as Phoebe called her, was 53 when she re-entered John's life. She had abandoned him when he was just 5 years old and had a history of theft and cocaine addiction. However, after going to rehab, Mama reconnected with her son and granddaughter, hoping to change. Her own mother had abandoned her when she was a toddler, leaving Mama to grow up without the love and care she needed. When Phoebe was still a toddler, Mama decided she had found a reason to stay sober. She returned from rehab, determined to be a better grandmother. But her return didn't mend the broken bond with John. The smallest comment on how to raise Phoebe would trigger his anger. "You didn't raise me," John would yell. "Why do you want to raise my daughter?" John's temper flared often. Every few months, he would lash out at Mama or Michelle, breaking walls and windows. They would eventually be evicted, unable to keep up with rent and move again. Things were so weird and demented for so long, Michelle recalled. John believed that every apartment they lived in was cursed by bad spirits, blaming them for the chaos. Michelle told him, "You're the demon." Despite DCF's initial conclusion that signs of present danger were low, the police were frequently called to their home. Phoebe became a silent witness to her father's violent behavior. She saw him drag Mama by her feet down the stairs, punch her in the face, and pour hot coffee on Michelle. Phoebe watched as John threw a concrete block at Michelle, tried to strangle her with Christmas lights, and chased her into closets and bathrooms. One day, Phoebe saw him shove Michelle into the sand, punch her face 3 times, and then chase her into the bathroom, slamming her head against the tub. John went to jail after that incident, but Michelle dropped the charges, as she had done before. She moved out, finally done with John. When John was released, he turned the situation around, telling a judge that Michelle had pulled a box cutter on him. A child protection investigator noted cuts on John's wrist that appeared self-inflicted. But despite this, John managed to gain some control over the situation, securing Phoebe's benefits and a restraining order against Michelle. She was never notified about the hearing and couldn't afford a lawyer to contest it. Though no one officially gave John custody, the restraining order kept Michelle from seeing Phoebe for over a year. By June 7, 2013, DCF had concluded that there were risks to Phoebe's safety due to her father's history of abuse and neglect. A month later, after John's DUI arrest and Michelle's theft charge, the agency reported that the couple was no longer together. They noted that John interacted with Phoebe in a caring manner and closed the case with verified findings of family violence, which continued to threaten Phoebe's safety. Despite all the police calls and DCF reports, none of the interventions saved Phoebe. None helped John, who had been just a child when DCF first entered his life. Over Phoebe's 5 years, each incident was reviewed, but no one connected the dots. Phoebe never had a consistent caseworker who understood that her father was violent, using drugs, and dragging her around from place to place with her clothes in a garbage bag. Michelle pleaded with John to let her see Phoebe, but he kept moving, changing his phone number, and leaving her too sick to fight back. During one of the few visits by an investigator to Phoebe at daycare, Phoebe simply said, "I miss Mommy." At what point should a parent lose custody of their child? Is it when they have no stable home? When they abuse drugs or alcohol? When they physically harm others? When they refuse to take medication to manage a mental illness? When they keep getting arrested for domestic violence? When concerned neighbors and family members called the abuse hotline repeatedly, worried about the child's safety, John Johnchuk Jr. seemed to do everything possible to get the state's attention. But still, nothing changed. Florida's Department of Children and Families, DCF, has long been overwhelmed and understaffed. The state's abuse hotline receives about 300,000 calls a year, but 20% are dismissed without investigation. The rest are passed on to overworked investigators who manage 25 cases at a time. DCF's primary goal is to keep families together, but over the past decade, almost 500 children, who had already been investigated, died while under their parents' care. Many of those parents, including Phoebe's, were under state-sanctioned safety plans. Child protection investigators visited Phoebe 5 times, noting clear signs of danger. But each time, they left her in her father's care. Everyone agreed that John adored Phoebe. She constantly told him, "I love you, Daddy." John taught her the alphabet, how to hold a crayon, and how to write her name. He brushed her long, uncut hair and let her win at tic-tac-toe. When she cried, he gave her candy. And at night, Phoebe fell asleep to Blue's Clues because she was afraid of the dark. But their lives were never stable. They never lived alone, just father and daughter. John always needed company and money for rent. With Phoebe by his side, he was able to play the role of the sympathetic single dad, receiving second chances from others. He desperately craved acceptance and understanding, but when he felt rejected or abandoned, he would lash out, especially at those closest to him. In the year leading up to Phoebe's death, John dragged her from one temporary living situation to another. He moved in with at least 8 different family members and friends. 5 single mothers expressed that they didn't want him staying with them, but they couldn't bear to leave Phoebe homeless. At Linda Mattow's house, John got his hair highlighted and did her taxes while she took him to church. At Amanda Serrano's house, he made spaghetti while Phoebe watched toddlers in tiaras. Amanda eventually told him to stop using meth around his daughter. He looked at me with these nasty eyes, these devil eyes. Not like the John the first knew, Amanda said. That was when he smoked that meth. At Melody Dishman's house, John trashed the guest room, leaving chip bags scattered everywhere. One evening, when Phoebe asked for a fruit cup before dinner, John became so angry that he dragged her by the arm to her room. Melody, concerned for Phoebe's safety, scolded John, but there were many other times he scared them. While living with Melody in 2014, John's temper exploded. He trashed their bedroom, and when Melody told him to leave, he broke the bed. This was the only time anyone saw him get physically rough with Phoebe, but there were countless other instances where his behavior terrified the people around him. One morning, after using meth all night, John drove Amanda and her brother in a fit of rage. When they started arguing, John floored the accelerator, speeding 100 miles per hour down the highway while Amanda screamed in terror. It was like he blacked out, Amanda recalled. Every time a roommate kicked him out, John called the cops on them in retaliation. He left behind a trail of dirty clothes, trash, and broken furniture, taking only Phoebe with him. For a brief time, John's uncles took Phoebe in while he slept at a friend's house. Phoebe loved their big Victorian home, with Reese's cups in crystal dishes and koi fish swimming in the backyard pond. Brian and Tim, concerned about Phoebe's safety with John, even started printing adoption paperwork. But just like his father had done 20 years earlier, John screamed, "I'm not going to let 2 fags raise my kid." And so, Phoebe was pulled back into the chaos of her father's unstable life. Phoebe turned 5 on the second day of kindergarten. John brought cupcakes to class, but when it was time to leave, Phoebe clung to his leg, crying uncontrollably. Mika Olivier, her teacher at Cleveland Elementary, had never seen such separation anxiety. She just didn't want to leave her daddy's side, she recalled. After a month of Phoebe's constant fits, John lost his patience in front of Mika. "Why does it have to be this way?" he snapped. The next day, Phoebe's mama started bringing her to school, and the drop-offs became easier. Mama rearranged her schedule at the deli and always made sure she was first in line to pick Phoebe up. That fall marked the most stable time in Phoebe's short life. She moved in with Mama while her dad stayed with friends. Phoebe learned simple things like gargling and saying her prayers. At night, she slept next to Mama in her double bed, clutching her life-size baby doll, Lucy. In the mornings, Mama would sing "You Are My Sunshine" as Phoebe woke up. At school, Phoebe made friends and sat at the table by the window. She learned to cut shapes and sound out words. Her teacher, Mika, said Phoebe was always well-behaved and polite, never showing any signs of neglect or abuse. Phoebe was always clean, Mika said. She said please and thank you and knew how to share. Mika added she was loved. Phoebe never missed a day of school. At Mama's house, Phoebe was happy. She smiled in her sleep, hogging the bed at night. But one night, she woke up screaming. Trembling, she told Mama, "I dreamed someone was taking me from you." A Thanksgiving reunion in 2014 was a turning point. Phoebe's mom, Michelle, begged John to let her see their daughter. He finally agreed, and they met at Denny's for Thanksgiving dinner. The wait at Cracker Barrel was too long, so they settled for turkey and stuffing for $9.49. Michelle brought her new boyfriend, a weekend wrestler, and Phoebe seemed to like him. After dessert, Phoebe asked to stay with her mom, but John refused. He was too hurt by Michelle moving on and starting a new life. For a man who feared rejection, the next month delivered a series of blows. He lost 2 new jobs, his friends stopped returning his calls, and Michelle wanted Phoebe back in her life. John's bitterness began to show. He called the child abuse hotline, slandering Phoebe's mom, while 2 other people called about him. He harassed his friend Melody with strange, threatening texts. When he received letters about his lawsuit against the Cheesecake Factory and Social Security's demand for Phoebe's benefits, it all seemed too much. Phoebe kept asking to see her mom. So, on Christmas Eve, they all gathered at Michelle's house. John, Mama, Michelle, her boyfriend, her teenage son, and Phoebe. John brought Sonny's barbecue, and to everyone's surprise, he said a blessing. Mama thought maybe her prayers had been answered. Perhaps John had found God. John became fixated on his stepmom's huge Swedish Bible, carrying it everywhere, even to bed. But as the new year approached, things took a darker turn. He had been working part-time, but his temper flared. After nasty exchanges with Michelle, the texts between them became full of name-calling and threats. "I want nothing to do with you ever again," he texted her. "No one wants anything from you. We want the baby safe. That's all." But with John's anger intensifying, it was clear things were spiraling out of control. On December 29th, Phoebe's mom called the DCF hotline, saying John had no stable address and that he had slapped Phoebe in the face years ago. The DCF counselor, however, failed to get John's address, and as a result, no investigation was ever made. The next day, John called to accuse Phoebe's mom of being insane and using drugs. DCF visited her home, but she passed their drug test. On New Year's Eve, John filed for another injunction against Phoebe's mom, claiming her new boyfriend was dangerous and that there were ammo, knives, and swords in the home. The judge denied his request. That night, Phoebe sat in Mama's lap, watching her great-uncles set off fireworks. She devoured 2 steaks, medium rare, and fell asleep before midnight. In the first week of January, John reached out to several people with a rare request: forgiveness. "I am very sorry for being such a D-head and saying mean and horrible things. I was an addict," he texted. He also texted his uncles, "Please don't give up on me," but no one responded. John had burned every bridge he had. On Sunday, he spent the day at his mom's house, mulching her yard and playing old maid with Phoebe. His mom kept expressing how much she wished she could keep Phoebe. But that night, John snapped. He barged into his mom's room and yanked Phoebe out of bed. "You're not taking my kid," he shouted. His mom was shocked as he stormed out of the house, carrying Phoebe to his dad and stepmom's home. "If I'd tried to take her back," she later said, "he would have beaten me up." On Monday, when Phoebe's seat in kindergarten remained empty, her teacher hoped she was just sick. But when Phoebe didn't show up the next 2 days, Mika began to wonder if she should call to check. At his dad's house, John became even more fixated on his stepmom's huge Swedish Bible. He sprinkled salt around the doorways to keep bad spirits away and began telling his stepmom that Phoebe was a demon. At work, John started quoting Bible verses talking about Abraham and Isaac and about sacrificing a lamb. His boss, Scott, didn't understand the Old Testament story, and so he just thought John's ramblings were bizarre. Either he was mentally unstable or on drugs, Scott said. I couldn't tell which. Scott and Amanda discussed the possibility of getting John some help. But he can't check in somewhere, Scott told Amanda, or he'll lose his daughter. That evening, John told Scott, I'm going to be fine. Then he said something that no one would understand until later. I've got to walk the pyramid, John told his coworkers. I just hope when I get to the top, I don't have to do it. I hope I don't have to make that sacrifice. I hope someone stops me. At the lawyer's office, Phoebe curled up in a green chair by the window. It had been a strange morning. This was the third day she had missed kindergarten. Her dad was jumpy and upset, still wearing his pajama pants. He had brought her here first thing, then disappeared upstairs with a lawyer. The paralegal was kind. She handed Phoebe a cup of crayons and a blue piece of paper. Phoebe drew a house, a simple rectangle for the bottom, a triangle on top. She always drew houses. In her 5 short years, she had lived in 15 different homes. She gave the house a yellow roof and a green door. Upstairs, attorney Genevieve Torres had the custody petition ready. All her client had to do was sign, but he was talking fast and waving his hands, not making any sense. John had brought a large black satchel, which he laid on the table between them. He pulled out a heavy, ancient leather-bound Bible. Read this, he said. Genevieve looked at the yellowed pages, but they were printed in a foreign language. You're the creator, he insisted. You can read any language. Genevieve started to feel uneasy. No one would hear her if she screamed, she thought. John rambled on about wanting to be baptized. He had an appointment with a priest in an hour. The more Genevieve tried to bring him back to the topic of his case, the angrier he became. After a few minutes, he said, Don't worry about filing the paperwork. None of this is going to matter tomorrow. Genevieve's mind raced with terrifying thoughts. Was he planning to move? Take Phoebe to Mexico? Or worse, was he going to hurt Phoebe's mom? She knew she had to get John out of the office, then immediately call the police to intercept him at the church. She helped him zip the Bible back into its bag and ushered him downstairs toward the door. Can Phoebe stay with you? John asked. Just while I go to the church? Genevieve hesitated. She didn't know Phoebe well, and she didn't want the little girl to be scared. And if she let Phoebe stay, would John come back and accuse her of kidnapping his daughter? She glanced over at Phoebe, still coloring. Her own daughter was about the same age. Phoebe would be safe at the church with a priest until the cops arrived, Genevieve thought. She told John he would have to take Phoebe with him. Phoebe didn't want to leave yet. She wanted to finish her picture. She added a stick figure girl with long orange hair and a green circle on top like a halo. Phoebe had 13 hours left to live. More than a dozen people would see Phoebe that final day, priests, deputies, well-meaning strangers. They saw her dad acting erratically, and many grew worried about her safety. Some intervened, while others did what was expected. Counselors screened calls. Investigators filed reports and consulted Florida statutes and child maltreatment indexes. But the system was impersonal, its protocols rigid, and it was always frightening to act on gut instinct. How could so many people sense something was terribly wrong and still allow a little girl to die? Attorney Genevieve Torres from Family First Law Group felt a wave of fear when John demanded she read his ancient Swedish Bible. Genevieve, who had never called the police on a client, knew that doing so would violate her attorney-client privilege. But the situation felt different. John was acting erratic, claiming that she was God, and nothing he said made sense. It wasn't just about the custody petition. It was about Phoebe, the little girl in his care. When John left the office, Genevieve immediately instructed the paralegal, call 911. Her voice broke as she spoke to the dispatcher. He's crazy, and he has a minor child with him. She tried to steady her voice. I should have kept the child. By 11 a.m., Phoebe was following her father through the dim sanctuary of St. Paul Catholic Church in Tampa. John had dragged Phoebe there, insisting he needed to be baptized. He told the priest he was the Pope, then corrected himself, claiming he wasn't. He said he was possessed and asked for an exorcism. The priest gave him baptism forms but also grew concerned. 2 sheriff's deputies, one trained in mental health, arrived to evaluate John. He didn't seem drunk or high, though his behavior was unsettling. He claimed he was experiencing clarity and said that God had spoken to him. When asked about his custody battle, he said he wasn't upset. Phoebe appeared happy, waving at the deputy when she left the church with her father. The situation didn't improve. John drove Phoebe to St. Lawrence Catholic Church, then back to St. Paul Church, demanding baptism again. He threatened to find another church. At Lake Magdalene United Methodist Church, John spoke of being related to the Pope and placed his heavy Bible on the receptionist's desk. She gave him the pastor's email and he left, suddenly calm. Despite the warning signs, no one intervened in time. Phoebe was still with John. How could so many people see something was wrong and still let this tragedy unfold? Genevieve waited anxiously for the phone to ring, hoping the sheriff's office would tell her that John had been committed. But when the call finally came, she was livid. "How is that even possible?" she asked. "What else do they need?" The deputy calmly explained that John didn't appear to be a danger to himself or Phoebe. He was on his way back to Genevieve's office to pay the filing fee for the custody petition. That didn't make sense to Genevieve. If John wasn't filing the papers, why would he bring the money? Was he coming back to harm her for calling the authorities? The unease she had been feeling only intensified. As the day dragged on, John began calling her office 8 times in the next hour. He kept insisting that Phoebe wasn't really his daughter, a strange claim that only deepened Genevieve's worries. While the paralegal handled the calls, Genevieve dialed the Florida Department of Children and Families, DCF, hotline, desperate for help. For 18 minutes, she shared everything she knew. John's delusional behavior, his strange insistence that she was God, and his claim that Phoebe wasn't his child. "He's delusional and has a child with him," Genevieve told the counselor. She was almost in tears. "I just can't believe he didn't meet the standard for being Baker acted," but the counselor didn't agree. "Based on the information you've provided, unfortunately, it doesn't rise to the level of Florida statutes for us to accept the report at this time," she said. Genevieve's heart sank. She couldn't believe that, despite everything, the system wouldn't intervene. She tried to stress that John was mentally unstable and that Phoebe, a 5-year-old girl, was in danger, but it wasn't enough. At 3:25 p.m., the report was shelved, dismissed as insufficient. Later that evening, everything seemed calm. John napped while his stepmom fed Phoebe, and the family settled in for a quiet night of watching cartoons. But something was off. John had been acting erratically, even placing sea salt around the doorways and telling his stepmom that Phoebe was a demon. When his mother came to pick Phoebe up, John promised to take her to school the next day. But then, about half an hour later, John called, saying he didn't feel well. Mama, Phoebe's grandmother, urged him to go to bed and let Phoebe stay the night. But that was just the calm before the storm. Around 9:30 p.m., John began texting his friend Noemi, saying they were meant to be together. He spoke of scripture and sea salt and mentioned the Skyway Bridge, asking her how many people had jumped. Noemi didn't reply, she was terrified. Around 10 p.m., John's father and stepmother heard the car leave, thinking John was simply taking Phoebe to his mother's house. They didn't know that Phoebe was shivering in the cold, barefoot and wearing a gold cross necklace from John's uncles. What they didn't see was that John had stuffed Phoebe's Christmas presents into trash bags in the trunk of the car. John didn't head to his mom's house. Instead, he drove Phoebe to Noemi's apartment complex. When Noemi didn't answer the door, he paced the parking lot, holding Phoebe's hand. A neighbor noticed Phoebe was barefoot, but no one called the police. By midnight, John had sped down the interstate, heading for the Skyway Bridge. A St. Petersburg officer, Sergeant William Drew Vickers, saw John's white PT Cruiser racing down the road at a high speed. The officer tailed him, radioing in the license plate. Just after midnight, the officer's voice changed from one of confidence to confusion as John's car suddenly slowed down. The PT Cruiser veered to the right, coming to a sudden stop at the top of the Dick Missinger Bridge. A bulky man with dark, unkempt hair climbed out of the driver's side, wearing plaid pajamas and clutching a large black book. His appearance was chaotic, but what happened next was even more unsettling. "Get back in the car," the officer yelled, trying to regain control of the situation. But the man ignored him, walking directly toward the officer. He was just a car length away when he yelled, "You have no free will." The officer's hand tightened on his gun, keeping it pointed toward the man. But he didn't stop. Instead, the man moved to the rear passenger door of the car and ducked inside. The officer, now even more on edge, shouted again, "Let me see your hands." The man didn't reach for a weapon. Instead, he emerged holding a child in his arms. The girl's face was pressed into his shoulder, her long curls hanging down her back. In that moment, the officer's heart dropped. The child was Phoebe, the little girl who had been caught in the terrifying grip of her father's delusions. With his eyes fixed on the officer, the man began to walk toward the edge of the bridge. Phoebe stirred slightly in his arms, likely waking up and realizing the cold and confusion of her surroundings. She nestled into her father's embrace, unaware of the perilous situation she was in. The officer's stomach churned as he saw them move closer to the guardrail. It was a moment frozen in time, every second counting. The officer shouted, "Stop! Put the child down." But the man didn't respond. Instead, he hoisted Phoebe over the concrete barrier, holding her out over the edge. The officer's voice shook with panic as he saw the man's intent. A faint scream echoed through the night. Then came the unmistakable sound of a splash, sending a shockwave of horror through the officer. He just dropped his kid over the railing into the water, Sergeant Vickers shouted into his radio, his voice filled with disbelief and panic. "He's fleeing south to the toll plaza." His voice broke as he pleaded, "Give me rescue. I'm right on the interstate. The kid's in the water." Frantically, Sergeant Vickers ran to the railing, searching the dark water below with his flashlight. His beam swept across the dark expanse, but there was no sign of Phoebe. Only the sounds of the waves slapping against the concrete pilings below, the occasional bob of a boat, and the rush of traffic. "I'm going to try to go down the ladder," he radioed. "Can we get someone to light up the water?" The ladder was slippery, metal, and encased in an open cage, clinging to the side of the bridge. The current from the east was pushing against the tide, making the rescue even more difficult. "Be careful on the ladder," came the warning over the radio. The winds at 25 miles per hour, and the currents pushing toward the old Holiday Inn. Determined, Sergeant Vickers began his descent. His flashlight illuminated the dark water below as he prayed, "Please let me see her. Please let her be okay." But all he heard was the deafening sound of traffic above and the howling wind around him. The officer reached the bottom, sweeping the flashlight over the mangroves and mist-covered water. His search continued, but Phoebe was still nowhere to be found. Meanwhile, John, now in full flight mode, sped through the toll booth over the Skyway Bridge, heading into Manatee County. A convoy of police cars followed, sirens blaring. A police helicopter hovered above, its spotlight swinging across the highway. "Shut down the interstate," came the frantic call over the radio. John made a reckless U-turn on Interstate 75, nearly colliding head-on with another officer's car. Deputies threw stop sticks onto the road, but John tore through them, blowing a tire in the process. Still, he refused to stop. "Let me see your hands," an officer shouted over the radio. "Get out of the vehicle." But John stayed seated, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. "Get out of the vehicle," the officer shouted again. When John remained still, the officer smashed the driver's side window with a baton, reaching in to pull John through the broken glass. By this time, Phoebe had been in the water for 13 long, agonizing minutes. Minutes that felt like an eternity as rescuers desperately searched for her. Alice Elliott, a 21-year-old member of Eckerd College's search and rescue team, was no stranger to the water. But nothing could have prepared her for this. On that cold night, as their 26-foot boat cut through the dark waves beneath the Sunshine Skyway Bridge, she fought to push the horror out of her mind. Someone had thrown a child off the bridge. A child. And they were the ones who had to find her. Alice had been in her dorm when the call came. A false alarm, she had hoped. But as a part of the only student-run marine rescue program in the country, there was no backing out. She and 4 other students raced into the night, hearts pounding, knowing that survival chances were slim. Every minute felt like an eternity. The water was freezing, the current unforgiving, and every flicker of light they saw from other boats or helicopters only deepened their dread. A seagull, someone thought. False hope. Hours passed, each one stretching out like a nightmare. Then, Ryan Morgan, one of Alice's teammates, shouted, "Contact!" His voice cut through the tension. They rushed to the spot. Alice's flashlight danced across the water, and there, floating in the dark, was a small, pale face surrounded by matted hair. She looked like a doll, too still, too unnatural. They pulled the child aboard, her cold, bloated body heavy in their arms. Alice's heart sank as she noticed bruises on the little girl's back. She tried to revive her, speaking softly, praying that the child wouldn't be scared. But time was running out. Ryan, who had only practiced CPR on mannequins, now fought desperately to save a real life. Salt water filled his lungs as he worked, but it was clear. The chances were fading fast. Elsewhere, John Chuck, Phoebe's father, was arrested. Disheveled, erratic, claiming to be God. He showed no remorse for what he'd done. He demanded an attorney but seemed detached from reality, only showing emotion when he asked, "Is Phoebe okay?" It was too late. The damage had already been done. As law enforcement closed in on him, no one even checked if John was under the influence. A child's life had been thrown into the depths, and the answers remained buried beneath the waves. Every night, Mama kisses Phoebe's doll, Lucy, then tucks her into the bed they once shared in her Tampa Heights apartment, just as she did with Phoebe. Guilt and regret ripple through the community, each wave of sorrow carrying unspoken what-ifs. Across Tampa Bay, tributes pour in for the 5-year-old girl whose face has flooded the news. White crosses on the bridge, Facebook pages, 5K fundraisers. Skinny's Bar hosted a poker run. An American Legion post planted a tree. The Eckerd College students who found her raised funds for a southeastern guide dog, naming a yellow lab puppy after her. Unlike other tragic stories where the victim remains anonymous, Phoebe had been loved by so many. Strangers felt as though they had missed something, and they were left wondering, what should have been done differently? The cop on the bridge. What if he'd left work earlier or later? Would John still have pulled over? If he'd fired, would Phoebe have been hit? The lawyer who called 911. She kept repeating that she should have kept Phoebe. But when John came back for her, what else could she have done? The kindergarten teacher. Why didn't she check on Phoebe? Why wait? The single moms who let John and Phoebe stay with them. What if they hadn't kicked John out? His uncles who asked to adopt Phoebe. Why didn't they push harder? Phoebe's mother. She wished she had fought harder to see her daughter, that she'd pressed charges when John hurt her, sent him to jail. Mama. She blamed herself. If she hadn't doted on Phoebe, maybe John wouldn't have been so jealous. What if I killed her because I loved her too much? Mama sobbed. What about John's stepmom, his dad, the 2 priests who sent him away, the deputies who let him go? No one was willing to speak. At Phoebe's funeral, everyone wore her favorite colors, pink and purple. Mama hung Phoebe's school picture in her living room window, decorating it for every holiday. Phoebe's fall from the bridge lasted less than 2 seconds. The autopsy revealed bruises the size of cantaloupes on her back, scrapes near her ear and ankle. Fluid filled her lungs. The cause of death, drowning. But the real question remained, why did she die? Over the last 5 years, 215 Florida children have died from inflicted trauma, beating, shaking, drowning. 1/4 were kids DCF knew about, like Phoebe. Half had parents with past DCF reports like her father. Phoebe's case had red flags: unstable housing, substance abuse, domestic violence. The call to the hotline should have sparked an investigation, but mental health issues weren't a reason to open a case back then. After Phoebe's death, DCF added new questions for counselors to ask. Is the caregiver delusional? Hallucinating? If yes, investigators must visit within 4 hours. 7 calls had been made about Phoebe, but bias against frequent reports led some investigators to dismiss them as custody issues. The report found that John's fear of losing custody was the primary stressor leading to Phoebe's death. In court, John, handcuffed and staring at the floor, answered the judge's questions. "I want to leave it in the hands of God," he said when asked if he wanted an attorney. "Pretty sure God is not going to represent you," the judge replied. Phoebe's classmates at Cleveland Elementary made stepping stones for a reading garden in her name. Mama had planned a birthday party with a bounce house, but instead, they took balloons to the cemetery. People planted flowers and left gifts by her grave. Her classmates pressed shiny glass pebbles into stepping stones, leaving a crystal angel so Phoebe wouldn't be in the dark. No one writes or visits John. He spends his days in a small room with a metal door. His mom is the only one who takes his calls. He's sorry, he says, but no one can understand what was going through his mind the night on the bridge. Phoebe's school picture, framed in her mama's living room, serves as a painful reminder of what was lost.